What if I told you that Elisha lived one of the deepest spiritual journeys in the Biblia without ever seeking attention or recognition? The Historia Biblica of his life reveals something unsettling. The greatest miracles were not born from ambition, but from communion with God. While many desire God's power, few desire the process that shapes the heart. And that is exactly where Elisha stands apart. The Biblia shows that Elisha did not chase spiritual fame. He pursued God's presence. Every step of his journey reveals a man who chose to remain faithful when no one was watching, obedient when it made no sense, and sensitive when pain knocked at the door. The Historia Biblica makes it clear that the supernatural was not the ultimate goal, but the natural outcome of a life aligned with God. Here is the counterintuitive truth. Elisha experienced extraordinary miracles because he never placed miracles at the center. The Biblia teaches that he placed God at the center instead. And when that happens, everything changes. Faith stops being mere words. Obedience stops feeling like a burden, and communion stops being a ritual. The Historia Biblica confronts us with a quiet but powerful question. What truly sits at the center of our spiritual life? Throughout this content, you will see that the lessons from Elisha are neither theoretical nor distant. They speak to real crises, difficult decisions, pride, pain, practical faith, and daily dependence on God. The Biblia remains alive, and the Historia Biblica of Elisha proves that a life of communion is still the surest path to true transformation. So, before we dive in, do this. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, the goal is not religious entertainment, but real spiritual growth rooted in the Biblia. And now comes the invitation that changes everything. Are you willing to walk with God the way Elisha did? The first lesson we learn from Elisha is that God calls ordinary people for extraordinary missions. The Biblia presents this moment in a simple, almost discreet way within the Historia Biblica. Elisha was working in the field, immersed in a common routine when the calling took place. This reveals that God's extraordinary work often begins in ordinary human settings. The calling does not depend on position, but on willingness. In the Biblia, the Historia Biblica of Elisha makes it clear that God does not wait for perfect circumstances to act. Elisha's field represents everyday life, with real responsibilities and repetitive tasks. God moves precisely in that environment, showing that faithfulness in daily life is fertile ground for greater purposes. It is not about where a person is, but about how they live where they are. This principle runs throughout the biblical narrative. Another important detail of this first lesson is that God's calling does not come with long explanations. The Biblia shows that Elisha understands the calling through the gesture of the mantle, not through a speech. The Historia Biblica teaches that spiritual sensitivity is more valuable than an excess of information. God speaks in simple but profound ways. Those who learn to discern these signs walk with greater clarity. Elisha's response also reveals something essential in this lesson. He does not ignore his reality, nor does he despise his responsibilities. The Biblia shows that he organizes his farewell before following the calling. The Historia Biblica teaches that spiritual maturity involves honoring the past while committing to the future. The calling does not cancel principles, it deepens them. This first lesson prepares the ground to understand that God is not searching for rare talents, but for available hearts. The Biblia, in telling the Historia Biblica of Elisha, dismantles the idea that only extraordinary people are called. God turns the ordinary into extraordinary when he finds faithfulness. And that faithfulness will be tested continuously along the journey. The second lesson we learn from Elisha is that the anointing is manifested through faithfulness to the calling. The Biblia makes it clear that the double portion was not merely an emotional desire, but the result of perseverance. The Historia Biblica shows that Elisha had to walk with Elijah until the very end. Anointing is inseparable from consistency. It reveals itself in remaining. In the Biblia, the Historia Biblica reveals that many followed part of the journey, but few reached the end. Elisha did not turn aside, did not settle, and did not negotiate his position. He remained faithful even when tested repeatedly. This teaches that anointing is not granted in the initial excitement, but in silent persistence. God honors those who do not give up halfway through the process. Elisha's faithfulness also shows that anointing is neither automatic nor inherited by proximity. The Biblia highlights that being close to the prophet was not enough. The Historia Biblica teaches that anointing requires real involvement, commitment, and obedience. It is not enough to accompany, it is necessary to continue. Remaining is a daily choice. Another strong point of this second lesson is that faithfulness is tested before the manifestation of power. The Biblia shows that Elisha only receives the mantle after remaining firm until the end. The Historia Biblica teaches that God releases authority after character has been refined. Anointing follows those who learn to sustain the calling with responsibility. This second lesson opens space for something even deeper. The Biblia begins to show that faithfulness not only sustains anointing, but prepares the heart to see beyond the natural. The Historia Biblica of Elisha is about to move into a level where faith is no longer just a decision, but a way of seeing. And that is exactly where the next chapter begins to unfold. The third lesson we learn from Elisha is that persevering faith releases miracles. The Biblia describes, within the Historia Biblica, a journey marked by constant movement and repeated tests. Elisha walks from place to place without distancing himself from Elijah, even when he is challenged to stay behind. This persistence reveals that true faith is not passive. It keeps moving forward. The miracle begins to take shape before it manifests. In the Biblia, the Historia Biblica shows that the perseverance of Elisha was not verbal, but practical. He did not merely declare faith, he remained present. Each stage of the journey reinforces that miracles do not arise from momentary decisions, but from consistency. Faith that produces results is faith that does not dissolve in the face of weariness. Persevering, in this context, is a repeated choice. Another important aspect of this lesson is that perseverance sharpens spiritual vision. The Biblia reveals that Elisha was not only following Elijah physically, but was also spiritually attentive. The Historia Biblica teaches that those who persevere begin to see what others cannot. Mature faith expands the perception of God's work. The supernatural becomes recognizable to those who remain. The journey of Elisha also teaches that perseverance requires silence and firmness. The Biblia shows that, when faced with attempts at distraction, he does not engage in long arguments. The Historia Biblica indicates that persevering faith does not need to constantly explain itself. It is sustained by inner conviction. It is a faith that moves forward even without applause. This third lesson prepares the setting for something even deeper. The Biblia suggests that perseverance not only leads to the miracle, but positions a person in the right place to witness it. The Historia Biblica of Elisha begins to show that faith that insists also learns to see beyond visible limitations. And that is exactly where the next lesson is revealed. The fourth lesson we learn from Elisha is that God's power surpasses natural limits. The Biblia reports that, after Elijah's departure, Elisha faces the Jordan River once again. The Historia Biblica shows that now he is alone, without his mentor by his side. The setting is the same, but the responsibility is greater. The natural limitation remains, but the source of power has not changed. In the Biblia, the Historia Biblica highlights that Elisha acts based on what he received, not on what he lost. He takes the mantle and confronts the obstacle. This reveals that God's power does not depend on external circumstances. When God acts, natural laws submit. The river is not a barrier when spiritual authority has been established. Another strong point of this lesson is that the miracle happens when faith is put into action. The Biblia does not describe hesitation, only action. The Historia Biblica teaches that God's power manifests when there is alignment between faith and attitude. The supernatural does not cancel human action. It responds to it. Elisha understands this and moves forward. The crossing of the Jordan also shows that natural limits do not define God's reach. The Biblia reinforces that what seems insurmountable to man is merely a detail to God. The Historia Biblica of Elisha teaches that divine power does not wear out, weaken, or remain confined to the past. It continues to operate in the present. This fourth lesson closes one cycle and opens another, even more intense. The Biblia begins to reveal that when God's power breaks natural limits, it also starts to operate in scenarios of crisis and need. The Historia Biblica of Elisha is about to enter moments where the supernatural not only amazes, but sustains lives. And that is where the next chapter begins to take shape. The fifth lesson we learn from Elisha is that God brings provision where there is scarcity. The Biblia, within the Historia Biblica, presents a scene of extreme vulnerability. A widowed woman in debt, without resources and without prospects. The problem is not only financial, it is emotional, social, and spiritual. Scarcity here represents moments when everything seems to be lacking at once. And it is precisely in these situations that God chooses to act. In the Biblia, the Historia Biblica shows that Elisha does not ignore the pain, nor does he spiritualize the problem in a superficial way. He listens, asks questions, and gives direction. This reveals that God cares about real and concrete needs. Divine provision does not begin with the miracle itself, but with clear guidance. Before multiplying, God organizes what already exists. Another strong point of this lesson is that God uses what little a person has. The Biblia emphasizes that there was only a small amount of oil. The Historia Biblica teaches that provision does not depend on the initial quantity, but on obedience to the process. What is small, when set in motion, becomes sufficient. God does not create waste. He produces multiplication. The narrative in the Biblia also reveals that provision increases as there is space to receive it. The Historia Biblica shows that the jars had to be gathered. This teaches that divine provision responds to expectation and preparation. Where there is no room, the flow stops. Where there is willingness, provision continues. This fifth lesson prepares the understanding that God does not merely resolve crises, but teaches how to pass through them. The Biblia, in telling this Historia Biblica, points out that God's provision sustains today and reorganizes tomorrow. And this reorganization requires something even deeper: sensitive obedience to divine direction. The sixth lesson we learn from Elisha is that obedience precedes the miracle. The Biblia, within the Historia Biblica, presents a scenario of war, confusion, and lack of water. The environment is chaotic, and the solution proposed by God seems, at first glance, illogical. Digging trenches without any sign of rain requires practical faith. Here, obedience comes before any evidence. In the Biblia, the Historia Biblica shows that God did not promise detailed explanations, only clear instructions. Elisha delivers the direction without embellishment. This reveals that obedience does not depend on full understanding. It is based on trust in the one who speaks and in those who obey. The miracle does not begin in heaven. It begins in action. Another striking aspect of this lesson is that obedience requires effort before reward. The Biblia shows that the people had to work through the night. The Historia Biblica teaches that miracles do not eliminate processes. God honors those who obey, even when they do not see immediate results. Obedience creates the path through which the miracle flows. The narrative also reveals that the miracle came in an unexpected way. The Biblia describes that the water arrived without wind and without rain. The Historia Biblica teaches that God is not limited by natural means. When there is obedience, He chooses how to act. The final result goes beyond what was imagined. This sixth lesson closes an important cycle. The Biblia begins to show that after external crises, God starts dealing with internal, emotional, and relational areas. The Historia Biblica of Elisha now moves toward encounters marked by care, compassion, and deep restoration. And it is within this atmosphere that the next chapter begins to unfold. The seventh lesson we learn from Elisha is that God cares about human pain. The Biblia, within the Historia Biblica, presents a hospitable woman who asks for nothing, yet carries a deep emptiness. Her pain is not loud or dramatic, it is silent. This reveals that God responds not only to public cries, but also to suffering kept within the heart. Divine care reaches even what is never spoken. In the Biblia, the Historia Biblica shows that Elisha perceives the pain before it is expressed. This teaches that divine compassion sees beyond words. God does not treat people as problems, but as stories. Attention to details reveals the value he places on human life. Where there is sensitivity, there is room for divine intervention. Another striking aspect of this lesson is that God acts without interest or exchange. The woman offers no sacrifice and makes no vow. The Biblia shows that the initiative comes from God. The Historia Biblica teaches that grace does not depend on merit. God moves out of love, not bargaining. The promise of a child also reveals that God restores dreams that had already been buried. The Biblia makes it clear that this expectation was no longer part of the woman's plans. The Historia Biblica teaches that God is not limited by emotional timelines. What was considered impossible can be reactivated by the right word. This seventh lesson prepares the setting for something even more intense. The Biblia begins to show that the same God who gives life is also able to restore it when everything seems lost. The Historia Biblica of Elisha now moves toward a moment where pain reaches its highest point. The eighth lesson we learn from Elisha is that the Lord has power over life and death. The Biblia, within the Historia Biblica, describes the unexpected loss of the promised son. The previous miracle did not prevent the next crisis. This reveals that faith does not eliminate challenges, but redefines how they are faced. Death here represents the ultimate limit of human experience. In the Biblia, the Historia Biblica shows that the woman does not surrender to public despair. She moves with determination and silent faith. This teaches that true trust is not the absence of pain, but direction in the midst of it. God honors firm postures even when the situation is devastating. Elisha's actions also reveal that restoration requires closeness and persistence. The Biblia describes an intense process, not an instant one. The Historia Biblica teaches that God is not bound to formulas. He acts in different ways according to what each situation requires. Divine power manifests with depth, not haste. Another important point of this lesson is that restored life glorifies God in an even more powerful way. The Biblia shows that death did not have the final word. The Historia Biblica reinforces that God is sovereign even over the most feared limits. Where there seemed to be an end, God establishes a new beginning. This eighth lesson closes a chapter marked by compassion and deep restoration. The Biblia begins to lead the narrative toward a new type of challenge, now connected to human pride and the need for humility. The Historia Biblica of Elisha continues forward, showing that not every miracle happens without inner confrontation. And it is at this point that the next chapter begins to unfold. The ninth lesson we learn from Elisha is that healing requires faith and humility. The Biblia, within the Historia Biblica, presents Naaman as a powerful, respected, and victorious man, yet deeply wounded by a disease he could not control. Leprosy exposes a strong contrast between external status and internal fragility. This reveals that position, recognition, and human strength do not eliminate the need for dependence on God. Healing begins when pride is confronted. In the Biblia, the Historia Biblica shows that Naaman expected a treatment compatible with his importance. He anticipated grand gestures, solemn words, and public recognition. The simple instruction delivered by Elisha shatters that expectation. God chooses methods that expose the heart before healing the body. The simplicity of the command reveals that the obstacle was never the disease, but inner resistance. Another strong point of this lesson is that true faith must overcome offense. The Biblia reports that Naaman almost missed his healing because he felt disrespected. The Historia Biblica teaches that God does not negotiate with the human ego. Healing was available, but it required submission. When faith submits, the miracle manifests. Naaman's final obedience reveals that humility does not diminish a person. It restores them. The Biblia shows that by immersing himself in the Jordan, he became equal to everyone else. The Historia Biblica teaches that God makes no distinctions based on titles. The same river, the same water, and the same promise were available. This ninth lesson points to a profound truth. God heals not only the body, but also the way a person sees themselves. The Biblia begins to show that after healing, something even more important will be tested. The Historia Biblica of Elisha now moves toward a direct confrontation with human motivation. The 10th lesson we learn from Elisha is that God's grace cannot be bought. The Biblia, within the Historia Biblica, shows Naaman attempting to reward the prophet after his healing. This gesture reveals a common mindset, turning grace into a transaction. God, however, does not operate by payment. The miracle was a gift, not a deal. In the Biblia, the Historia Biblica makes it clear that Elisha refuses any reward. This teaches that God's work is not for sale. Grace loses its meaning when it is linked to financial or human merit. God acts out of love, not advantage. This posture protects the purity of the miracle. The contrast becomes even clearer when the narrative introduces Gehazi's attitude. The Biblia exposes, within the Historia Biblica, that attempting to profit from grace leads to serious consequences. This reveals that the issue is not resources, but the heart. When grace is used for personal gain, it becomes distorted. Another strong aspect of this lesson is that hidden disobedience always comes to light. The Biblia shows that nothing escapes spiritual discernment. The Historia Biblica teaches that God values integrity more than appearance. The miracle cannot be separated from character. Where there is inner corruption, there is outward loss. This 10th lesson concludes the journey by showing that faith, humility, and integrity walk together. The Biblia closes this portion of the Historia Biblica of Elisha by revealing that the greatest miracle is not physical healing alone, but a heart aligned with God's grace. And now, with all these lessons revealed, the path is open for a deep reflection on how to live all of this in practice. When we look at the journey of Elisha, the Biblia does not present merely a prophet full of miracles, but a man who learned how to walk with God in every season of life. The Historia Biblica shows someone who was faithful in the ordinary, persistent in the process, obedient in the midst of chaos, compassionate in times of pain, and humble in the face of grace. None of this happened by chance. Everything flowed from a heart that chose to remain in communion with God day after day. Elisha teaches us that spiritual life is not built in isolated moments, but in continuous decisions. The Biblia reveals that every miracle was preceded by faithfulness, and every spiritual victory was born from a heart aligned with God. The Historia Biblica makes it clear that intimacy with God transforms not only external circumstances, but especially the inner life of a person. Communion is not perfection. It is constant dependence. Perhaps the greatest invitation that the life of Elisha offers us is this: to turn our hearts back to God, not only in words, but in posture, in choices, and in spiritual sensitivity. The Biblia reminds us that God is still looking for available people, not extraordinary ones, people who desire to walk with Him in a real, sincere, and deep way. The Historia Biblica proves that those who walk with God never remain the same. Now comes the reflection. Which of these lessons from Elisha spoke to you the most? Which one inspires or impresses you the most? Perseverance, obedience, compassion, humility, or faithfulness to the end? Share it in the comments, because your answer may encourage others who are also on this journey of faith. And if this content helped you, taught you something, or brought you closer to God, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you can keep learning, growing, and going deeper into the truths of the Biblia and the Historia Biblica. Walking with God is a journey, and it becomes even better when we walk it together.